Okay, so this lecture is on sort of what happens in the Latin East after the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, and looking at some of the systems that evolve as they begin to try and establish permanent control of these territories, as well as some of the challenges they faced. Outremer is the French word for what they call this area. So in French, beyond the sea, sort of over there. And we also use the terms Latin East. So this part of part of the Middle East that was controlled by people who ultimately trace their sort of religious belief system back to the Latin Christian Church as opposed to the Greek Orthodox or Eastern Church. So we'll sort of use those terms interchangeably. One of the best sources of what happens during this period is William of Tyre. His Deeds Done Beyond the Sea is just sort of a masterful sort of history of the region. And this is a contemporary image of William. Can't see him very well. In one of the many copies of his history that found its way up into Western Europe, was copied and then was illuminated. And it's William of Tyre who's writing from sort of a later period when things have actually started to really kind of go downhill. And so one of my favorite quotes by William is, "Things that have a bad beginning rarely end well," and this proves to be quite prophetic. So what do you have in this Outremer, Levant, Latin East after the First Crusade? So the Kingdom of Jerusalem, its borders and boundaries are going to sort of ebb and flow a bit, but you're talking about a territory that is about 500 miles long, from Egypt up to the border with Tripoli, and depending upon where you're at, 25 to 70 miles wide. It is paralleled by a mountain range in the east and the Mediterranean Sea in the west. And that does give it kind of some natural frontiers, but as you can see, it's also sort of surrounded by Muslim territories. So one of the first things that they have to figure out is how to stabilize the north. Also, they have control of Jerusalem after 1099, but that doesn't necessarily give them control of all the surrounding areas, especially the rural areas. And then that southern border is the one that's the most immediate in terms of a threat, because remember when the Crusaders laid siege to Jerusalem, the governor of Jerusalem was Egyptian. He was a Fatimid Egyptian, and so he sent word to the Caliphate of Cairo to send reinforcements. So that's going to be their most sort of pressing threat. So the Crusader states then emerge from these conquered territories. This is just sort of a brief overview of who eventually sort of comes to power in each, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of these in turn. So the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the immediate ruler is Godfrey of Bouillon. The county of Edessa up in the north initially is Baldwin of Boulogne, who's Godfrey's brother. And then eventually he's going to be succeeded by someone who's related to them, who's sort of a cousin, but we're not quite sure, another Baldwin. The Principality of Antioch, as we've seen, was sort of claimed by Bohemond of Toronto. He's from Norman Sicily. And then after Jerusalem falls, Raymond of Toulouse travels north and lays siege to Tripoli, and eventually that's going to emerge as the fourth of these Crusader states. So the county of Edessa is actually the earliest of the Crusader states to be formed, and it happens sort of separate from the rest of the Crusader conquests. So at a certain point, as they leave Antioch, Baldwin of Boulogne decides to kind of go rogue. So he heads east, and as he gets close to Edessa, which is a large, well-established city, he is actually sort of approached by the local ruler, an Armenian named Thoros. And Thoros has had his hands full, so he's Armenian. He has been sort of caught between Muslim Turks and Byzantine Greek Orthodox Christians. And there's no love lost between Armenian Christian and Eastern Orthodox Christians. So Thoros sees Baldwin and his military retinue as a way to kind of establish his own position. So he reaches out to Baldwin and he actually proposes an alliance. They follow this sort of Armenian customs where Thoros sort of adopts Baldwin, and he becomes his heir. Shortly after this happens, Thoros dies. Surprisingly, and under some suspicious circumstances. And so, in the absence of Thoros, though, Baldwin asserts his authority. He's pretty ruthless in this respect, but it seems to be sort of effective in quelling any other challenges to his authority. So, he's predominantly ruling then this county of an Armenian and Monophysite Christian population with sort of a small handful of sort of fellow Crusaders alongside him. And they're really sort of up north and east compared to the rest of the Crusader states, which does make them vulnerable to attacks by Muslims and attacks by Greeks. And you can see in this particular image, so the different types of foes that they're forced to sort of contend with. So the Principality of Antioch is established second after it's sort of conquered by the Crusaders. And then remember, there was some disagreement over who was going to sort of control that land when the rest of the army moved to Jerusalem. And the person who sort of ends up establishing his authority there is Bohemond of Toronto. So Bohemond begins to try and consolidate his control of Antioch, but in August of 1100, he and a small force sort of enter the field as sort of after some Muslim raiders. He's surprised in an ambush by a local sort of Turk Danishmend, and he is put in prison. And this is going to be sort of very typical of the experience of a lot of these crusade leaders. So the rank and file, in any sort of battle, the rank and file are killed, but the more sort of elite members of these Latin Christian forces would be imprisoned, and then they would be brought into captivity, sometimes short term, 6 weeks, 6 months. I think one of the longest was Jocelyn of Edessa, who was in prison for like 20 years. So ideally, they are held in prison until a ransom can be raised for them, and then they're released. So this is what happens to Bohemond. So he's in prison for a while. His nephew Tancred takes over as regent for him in Antioch, and then eventually the other crusade leaders are able to raise sufficient sums to get him released in 1104. He returns to Antioch. He hangs around for a little bit, but he's pretty determined to actually go back into Western Europe and raise additional forces and resources, and that's exactly what he does. He also marries the daughter of the King of France, and then returns to his home in Italy. He doesn't ever return to Antioch, so Tancred is going to serve as regent for Bohemond's son after Bohemond's death in 1111. But one of the things that's going to be an issue with Antioch, and we're going to look at this more moving forward, is Antioch was one of the cities that the Byzantines had most recently lost. And so while they're willing to kind of let Jerusalem go, Alexius and then his successors are pretty adamant that Antioch should be subject to their authority. And so they're going to put pressure on its northern borders, and then you're going to have these additional pressures from the Muslims along the eastern border. And so whoever controls Antioch is going to have his work set out for him or her. So the county of Tripoli then, so Raymond of Toulouse, after the fall of Jerusalem, Raymond of Toulouse eventually makes his way north. He takes a few smaller cities, and then eventually he takes Jerusalem, and then he lays siege to Tripoli. But this is a long, drawn-out siege, and he dies in 1105. Eventually, in 1109, the city is captured, and control of it then goes to Raymond's son Bertrand, who rules from 1109 until 1112. And then after Bertrand's death, it's his son Pons who's going to become the Count of Tripoli. Tripoli is a thriving city. It's been controlled by Muslims a little bit longer, so about half its population is Muslim, and then it also has a significant population of Greek Orthodox Christians. It's right on the sea, and so its ports are really sort of essential to not just trade, but also to securing its defenses. Then the fourth and final of the Crusader states, obviously, is the Kingdom of Jerusalem. This is an image of Godfrey of Bouillon when he eventually sort of becomes the leader of the kingdom. There are a few images of Godfrey, though not many. And we'll talk a little bit about why it is that he's chosen in a second. So initially, they have a number of challenges to face. This was probably not something that anyone really anticipated happening. Remember, there was also some confusion as to whether or not any territory conquered by the Crusaders would be given back to the Byzantine emperor. The Crusaders clearly had sort of their own view on that, and that was not an option for them. But it's very unlikely that Urban II ever really thought of what would happen after this territory was conquered. The majority of those who survived the Crusades, and that's probably, these estimates are tricky, but probably about a third of those who set out died either from military activity or from disease or from lack of food. So the army itself is sort of depleted, but then most of those who came don't stay. It wasn't their intention to stay. And so they return back to Western Europe. So the ones who remain have to kind of figure out, well, what's this going to look like? As much as they can try and sort of position this as a reconquest, these Latin Christians have never been in control of Jerusalem before, so they can't just restore whatever governing system was in place there before. And there is also some discussion whether or not the person who's the ultimate authority in Jerusalem should actually be a member of the church, perhaps an archbishop. Or do they want to adopt a more sort of secular authority? And it's not really clear how that argument plays out, but we do know that eventually they decide that it's going to be a secular authority, sort of modeled more on the kingdoms of Western Europe. We know that the Latin Christians are outnumbered, and so that's going to be sort of a challenge for them moving forward. And they're going to have to face these continued sort of pressures along the frontiers in their attempt to sort of expand and consolidate. One of the things we do know of those survivors who returned home, anyone who thought they would be rich after this was horribly mistaken in terms of sort of any monetary gains. But what they do return home with is a lot of relics. So relics are anything within medieval Christianity that is part of a saint's body or came into contact with a saint. So it's an object that has this particular spiritual and religious status. A lot of the relics that were really prized were somehow associated with Jesus. So because of the resurrection, there are no sort of bodily remains of Jesus, but there were a number of people who claimed to have things like a thorn from the crown of thorns or a shard from the cross. This is a relic that actually is housed today, or was, and they've moved it while they restore it, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. And it's a nail. It's believed to have been a nail that was used to nail Jesus to the cross. So relics like this were really, really sought after by the Crusaders, and many of them made their way back into Western Europe as a result of the Crusades. So the governing system that they do put into place is loosely modeled by what they're familiar with back in Western Europe. So there is this sort of feudal hierarchy to the extent that you have a lord, whether it's a count or a king, and then the lord had a series of vassals who are granted territories in return for services. It is not a feudal hierarchy in the sense that the Kingdom of Jerusalem has authority over the county of Tripoli and the Principality of Antioch. It doesn't work that way. These are all sort of, Jerusalem is most preeminent because of its spiritual and religious significance, but the other sort of rulers are autonomous. So the lands in each of these areas were divided up. and entrusted to supporters of, or trusted to the supporters of Godfrey, and primarily sort of the people who are favored are the people who were amongst the first Crusaders, at least initially. And this is going to become sort of a real sort of rift in the population. Were you sort of there from the beginning, or were you someone who came sort of later? But initially, most of this land goes to the early Crusaders, and the people who first were participated in the conquest. Over the course of time, control of these lands does become hereditary. And in addition to providing the king or the count with military service, you also sort of manage the local villages, and if you happen to control an urban center, the trade within that center, and obviously you take sort of some of the proceeds, and some of the proceeds go to the king. And so this is just a really rough sort of map that shows the different sort of vassals of the king of Jerusalem in this really early period. So most of this territory is actually rural. There are very few significant urban centers other than Jerusalem and some of the ports. We know that most of these villages were sort of had an Arabic structure by this time, or a sort of a Muslim structure. So there is a reis. This is an Arabic term for sort of leader. So there was one individual who sort of conferred with the council of elders about the decisions in the best interests of the village, sort of when to plant, when to harvest. Most of the land is worked communally, so all of the members of the community take on various tasks over the course of the year. Ultimately, they sort of divide the harvest, and then a certain portion is reserved for the lord or several lords. Most of these villages that sort of show up in the early records existed before the Crusaders came down, though there are a handful of varying sizes, and some scholars actually suggest up to 200 sort of colonial settlements. So these are new. They look a lot different. They are sort of very carefully planned developments. They're centered on a church, and they usually had some sort of defensive tower and a courthouse. They introduced sort of elaborate irrigation systems. And most of these are found in predominantly Christian-controlled territory. So not Latin Christians, but other sort of Armenian or Greek Christians, as opposed to, so the Latin Christians didn't establish these new settlements in the middle of predominantly Muslim areas. And this is one that's kind of sort of survived, at least some remnants of what was there. At the time, it's Cubeba. It's about 11 miles north of Jerusalem, and it's located along sort of an ancient Roman road. And they have been able to do some archaeological investigations and have found a lot of remnants of this early Crusade settlement. So in terms of the governing system that they put into place in Jerusalem, this is Godfrey again. So he is the first ruler. We're not quite sure how he gets to be the ruler. The terms of sort of his election are unclear, but we do know that he is chosen by the other Crusade leaders. So there is an elective element to this position initially. Some accounts suggest that Raymond of Toulouse was offered the crown and turned it down. Other accounts suggest that Robert of Normandy was offered the crown and turned it down. We just don't know because none of them are definitive. We do know that Godfrey said, "I do not want the title king. That doesn't seem appropriate to me." So he actually ruled under the official title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. And he is initially sort of tasked with consolidating control. In particular, there's this relief force coming from Egypt just several months after the conquest of Jerusalem. And so he marches out to Ascalon. It's a force of about 20,000 Egyptians. The Crusaders defeat that force. And this is really a decisive sort of victory for the Crusaders in terms of guaranteeing a future for their control of Jerusalem. As you can see, though, Godfrey does not rule for very long. He eventually dies in 1100. And so what happens is there's consultation amongst the leading sort of nobles and the leading members of the church in Jerusalem. And what they decide to do is call his brother Baldwin, who's been Count of Edessa, to Jerusalem to succeed him. Baldwin is not at all bothered by the title king. And so Baldwin the First is the first official king of Jerusalem. And he's going to rule in that capacity for about 18 years. So he sort of picks up where his brother left off, though turning his attention to the immediate demands of Jerusalem. So one of the things he needs to do is just consolidate control of the city. We do know that he does not feel confident that the city can be secure if the Jewish population and the Muslim population are allowed to remain. So many of them are actually forced out. He does hear stories of some Eastern Christians, so these are Greek Orthodox Christians, in some areas around the kingdom who have been sort of living in sort of difficult circumstances. So he invites them to come to Jerusalem and to establish control of a particular area. And so they're resettled. We do also in this early period see a significant number of pilgrims from the West that come for the purposes of settlement. And so estimates suggest that perhaps by about mid-century, you have about 30,000 Latin Christians in Jerusalem. And so you can see how things end up sort of dividing. So the Christian quarter and then the Armenian quarter, the Muslim quarter and the Jewish quarter then are sort of infiltrated by some of these settlers. Most of these settlers are French speaking. There are a small sort of smattering of Germans, but the fact that you have a place in Jerusalem called something like German Street is a pretty clear indication that that is not sort of the most dominant language that they're speaking. So Baldwin also knows that one of the first things he needs to do is really secure the cities along the Mediterranean, these port cities, so that he can use them as defense, but also use them as sort of conduits to get reinforcements or resupply from forces in the West. And so he enlists the Genoese. So the city of Genoa in Italy has a significant navy. And so the Genoese are offered terms to settle in some of these areas. And in return for sort of a third of all the spoils, they're given land, they're given tax breaks. And so you have significant sort of quarters in different parts of these port cities that have these sizable Italian populations. By 1112, most of these major ports are under Christian control. So Arsuf, Caesarea, Beirut, and Sidon. And it takes a few tries, but eventually he's able to capture the port city of Acre, which is going to be sort of central to the history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It has sort of this dual set of walls, and as you can see here, its fortifications sort of stretch far out into the Mediterranean. So in the meantime, though, while they're making sort of strides in terms of consolidation, they still do need more men, more resources, and more support. And so King Baldwin appeals to the West. Urban is dead. He dies before he finds out that they were able to capture Jerusalem. But his successor, Pascal, is very much sort of a supporter of the crusade efforts. And so he sort of he commissions a dozen papal legates to sort of preach another crusade across France in particular, and also into Germany. It's kind of a hard sell because a lot of the crusaders, while they came back with these incredible stories, and obviously this sort of earned remission of sins, they talk about this incredible hardship. This is no longer just sort of something you envision or imaginary. It's real now. And so for a lot of them, they do have a lot of harrowing stories of not being able to eat, of the sort of difficult conditions, of the attacks. And so for Baldwin, who's sort of pictured here at his coronation, he really needs the Pope to kind of help him put some pressure on individuals to go. We do know that by this time, the very earliest set of crusade texts, sort of, so like the Gesta Francorum and Albert of Aix, are sort of circulating. And so that provides sort of this incentive. They sort of work as propaganda. This could be you. And then the Pope helps. He threatens excommunication for those who did go on the First Crusade but deserted. Also, there are a number of people who vowed to go on the crusade in 1095 who never actually left. And so he starts to kind of call them out and say, hey, if you took a vow and you didn't go, you can be excommunicated. The leaders of this crusade, two of these are, in fact, those deserters. So Stephen of Blois and Hugh of Vermandois left during the siege of Antioch, and really that sort of desertion has sort of followed them ever since. This is actually the manuscript image of Adela of Blois, who's Stephen's wife. She's the daughter of the King of England, so she's a very high-ranking individual. She's also a very smart individual, and she doesn't pull her punches. And so we have several letters that she writes to Stephen when she learns that he deserted, just essentially sort of ripping him apart for what he did. He was a coward. He's going to hell. How could he have done this? And so in part, as a way to atone, Stephen and Hugh join the Crusade of 1101. And then William, Duke of Aquitaine, also goes. So this is a pretty high-ranking set of leaders who head off with this contingent, probably about the same number of participants as the First Crusade. So their stated purpose when they get to Constantinople and cross the Bosporus is to rescue Bohemond of Antioch. And so they split into two. This is a really well-planned, organized crusade. They have the advantage of their predecessors, so they know they need a lot of provisions. They know they're not going to be able to buy things along the way. But in spite of all that planning, just because of the nature of this expedition, eventually they sort of run out of provisions. And then this sort of brings them into conflict with local populations. We do know, and you can see this northern route here. So Danishmend, this is where Bohemond is being held. There is a small battle there in their attempt to free Bohemond where they're defeated. There are a number of other sort of encounters with local Turkish armies. Another one down near Tarsus or at Heraclea where they're also defeated. Hugh is wounded and he eventually dies of his wounds. Stephen is killed in battle. William of Aquitaine survives. Eventually does make it to Jerusalem with a very small contingent, but most of the men who go on crusade are either captured, killed, or enslaved, and so it's just this ragtag band that shows up in Jerusalem, and this is sort of an omen of things to come. So religious changes, one of the sort of commitments of the Latin Christians is to sort of reconvert or convert really because they have never been Latin Christian before. A lot of the holiest sites in and around this area into sort of Latin Christian foundations. So one of the first thing they do is they install patriarchs. So these are sort of the highest ranking individual within the church, second only to the Pope, in these towns. So there's a Latin patriarch in Jerusalem. There's a Latin patriarch in Antioch. They kick out the Greek patriarchs who've been there for centuries because this is going to be Latin Christian controlled territory. A lot of Muslim buildings are converted. So the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is central in Islam, is actually converted into the palace, the royal palace, where the kings of Jerusalem and their families live. The Dome of the Rock, that should say Dome of the Rock, which is also central to Muslim belief. This is where Muhammad ascended into heaven, is transformed into the Templum Domini, which is going to be associated with the Knights Templar moving forward. And then they take the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is associated with the ascension of Jesus into heaven. And then there are a few other sort of really important sites in the history of early Christianity right around this, and they enclose them into a single building. This is going to be where the kings of Jerusalem are crowned, as well as where they're buried. They also establish or reestablish a number of monasteries and nunneries. This is actually the Greek monastery San Sabas, and you can see this is a really well-developed complex. Most of the Latin Christian foundations have not survived after they lost control of the territory to Muslims in the 12th and 13th century. They were destroyed, but this one is just a very, very ancient sort of complex and still remains sort of an active monastery in the Greek Orthodox faith. In terms of hierarchy, then, the Franks, the Latin Christians, are on top. They were very, very dismissive of sort of Eastern Christians. They did not sort of share this affinity because they were both Christians. And then obviously you have Jews and Muslims sort of lower down. And then finally, what we start to see, particularly in the text, in the way people start to talk about the Crusades, is what happened in 1095 finally has some sort of a definition. They finally have sort of a more clear concept of what it means to be a crusader and what it means to go on crusade. So it's very much understood as this religious pilgrimage specifically for knights. It adds this sort of spiritual dimension to their natural function as warriors, and it gives sort of militaristic action this religious significance. We definitely see this in the texts that are used, sort of the Crusader text, but also the papal bulls and charters. These are Militi Christi, Knights of Christ. They take the path of the cross. So there's a lot of sort of rhetoric that's sort of associated with Jesus that's used to describe their actions. And then the one thing that becomes very, very clear is that crusade is sort of a divine enterprise, that it is very much sort of something that is controlled by God. And the first crusade then was successful because they had God's favor, because God determined that they were going to have this favorable outcome. The flip side of that, though, is then how do you explain failure? So the Crusade of 1101, obviously a failure. And so you see explanations of why attributed to, well, they were sinful, they did not have God's favor, something that they did must have sort of alienated God. So it's this sort of tricky way of understanding things, because what sometimes works in your favor can equally sort of work against you.